The spinning top game. Consider its brilliant mechanisms. First, there's the illusion of skill and agency. Just as society tells us we control our destiny through hard work and merit, the game presents itself as a test of individual skill. Yet, like our socio-economic systems, the parameters for success are predetermined by those in power. The time limit, the playing field's dimensions, even the weight of the top itself, all carefully calibrated to maintain the facade of fairness while ensuring predictable outcomes. Then, there's the beautiful cruelty of forced collaboration. Players must work together, yet individual failure threatens collective survival, rather like how modern workplaces preach teamwork while fostering competition. The game forces players to maintain their own spin while monitoring others, creating a self-policing system where participants become both victims and enforcers of control. How the game weaponizes hope. Each successful spin reinforces the belief that mastery is possible, that the next attempt might be better, much like how societal systems keep us engaged through the promise of advancement. The random successes of a few players serve as proof that the system works, obscuring its fundamental design as a mechanism of control. Even the spatial arrangement mirrors societal hierarchies, the VIPs watching from above, the guards maintaining order from the middle, and the players spinning desperately below. It's a vertical power structure made literal, with each level maintaining its position through the continuous motion of those beneath it. Like our own societal games, the rules appear simple and clear, yet their true complexity only reveals itself in the playing. By the time players understand the game's true nature, they're too invested or too desperate to stop spinning. The time pressure in the spinning top game is a perfect microcosm of modern productivity demands. Each player has precisely 30 seconds, a brutal compression of time that mirrors how modern work has been stripped to its bare efficiencies. Like contemporary workers chasing impossible KPIs, the players must perform increasingly complex tasks within artificially constrained time frames. How this pressure creates its own momentum. Just as the modern workplace uses time management apps, productivity metrics, and constant deadlines to maintain a perpetual state of urgency, the game's countdown forces players to operate in a constant state of barely controlled panic. The timer isn't just measuring time, it's weaponizing it. This feeds directly into its social Darwinian aspects. The elimination system is particularly elegant in its brutality. Like the corporate world up or out policies, it creates an artificial scarcity of survival. The game doesn't just eliminate the unfit, it actively manufactures conditions where most must become unfit. The parallel to modern meritocracy is striking. Just as our society claims to reward natural talent while ignoring systemic advantages, the game presents itself as a pure test of skill while being fundamentally rigged. The players who survive aren't necessarily the most skilled at spinning tops. They're the ones most adapted to performing under the artificial constraints of the system. The spinning top as a masterful metaphor for the precarious dance between agency and control. The players, much like the top itself, maintain their survival through a desperate momentum that appears free but is entirely orchestrated. A top only maintains its stability through constant motion. The moment it slows, it falls. Our players, too, can only survive through perpetual participation in this macabre dance. They're given the illusion of control. After all, they're the ones spinning the top, but the arena, the rules, the very physics of their survival are dictated by unseen hands. How the spinning top game captures the essence of late-stage capitalism itself. We're all spinning desperately to maintain our position, convinced we're in control of our motion, while the ground beneath us has been carefully tilted by others. The players' frantic attempts to keep their tops spinning mirror our own daily performances of productivity and purpose. The episode brilliantly uses the tension of the spinning top, that moment between perfect rotation and inevitable collapse, to reflect the larger game's balance between hope and futility. Each spin is a gamble, each wobble a reminder of mortality, and the constant whirring becomes the soundtrack to their collective anxiety. Most perverse is how this system creates its own justification. Those who succeed attribute their survival to personal merit rather than circumstance, just as many successful people in our society mistake privilege for pure talent. The eliminated players become cautionary tales, their failure serving as proof of the system's supposed fairness. It's a perfect closed loop of systemic violence. The pressure creates the failures that justify the pressure. Rather like watching natural selection on fast forward, but with all the natural parts carefully engineered. The spinning top game's elimination system is a pristine reflection of how modern society manufactures its necessary casualties. Consider the healthcare system, where acceptable loss rates are calculated with actuarial precision, or the education system's bell curve that predetermines failure rates regardless of actual performance. The game's brilliant perversity lies in how it mirrors our society's tendency to rebrand systemic violence as personal failure. Just as we speak of underperforming schools rather than underfunded ones, or poor financial planning rather than wage stagnation, the game transforms its deliberate design choices into apparent personal inadequacies. Look at how the time pressure creates what we might call bureaucratic casualties. Players who might execute the task perfectly under normal conditions but falter under arbitrary constraints. It's rather like watching someone miss a healthcare enrollment deadline by minutes and being deemed irresponsible rather than questioning why healthcare access has deadlines at all. The game's elimination mechanism is particularly reminiscent of how modern institutions process human beings. The players, like job applicants or loan seekers, must perform standardized tasks under standardized conditions. Those who fail are not victims of the system, but rather proof of its necessity. Their elimination becomes evidence of the process's rigor. Most insidious is how the system teaches survivors to internalize its logic. Just as successful people often defend the very systems that make success rare, surviving players begin to see their continuation as merit rather than chance. The eliminated become statistical necessities, their deaths transformed into data points that validate the system's efficiency. In essence, the game perfects what our society already practices, the automation of disparity, where human casualties become not just acceptable but necessary proof of the system's functioning. The Doctor, a character whose medical oath becomes a macabre parody in the game's context. The Doctor in Episode 5 serves as a masterful exploration of how professional ethics collapse under extreme pressure. Here's a character who transforms the sacred trust of medical knowledge into a survival commodity, performing unauthorized autopsies for the masked staff in exchange for advanced game information. How the show uses this character to illustrate the corruption of expertise in a system that commodifies everything. The Doctor's knowledge, meant for healing, becomes a tool for gaming the system, quite literally. It's rather like watching the Hippocratic Oath being rewritten by a hedge fund manager. How the Doctor's ultimate punishment comes not from breaking medical ethics, but from disrupting the game's artificial equality. The management executes them not for the desecration of bodies, but for creating an unfair advantage, a darkly comic prioritization that perfectly captures how systems can pervert moral hierarchies. Even more intriguing is how this character arc mirrors broader societal questions about the commercialization of healthcare. The Doctor's bargain, trading medical expertise for survival advantage, is just an extreme version of how medical knowledge often becomes gatekept and monetized in our own world. The show's use of democratic voting is a masterfully crafted critique of how democratic systems can be weaponized against their participants. The O/X voting mechanism after each game isn't just a decision point. It's a brilliant piece of systemic cruelty that forces players to become complicit in their own oppression. Players are given the freedom to vote on whether to continue their participation in a death game. It's democracy stripped to its darkest essence. The tyranny of the majority deciding who lives and dies, all while operating within parameters set by unseen powers. The voting scenes are particularly revealing in how they mirror real-world democratic dysfunction. The loudest voices dominate the discourse. Fear drives decision-making, and individual votes become acts of survival rather than conscience. When Yungbei and Hyunju Presso, it's not a choice made in freedom, but under the duress of debt and desperation. Most perverse is how the system uses this democratic process to legitimize itself. Just as modern institutions often use the appearance of choice to mask coercion, the game uses voting to transform its violence into a seemingly voluntary participation. The players aren't victims of a system, they're choosing to stay. This mirrors uncomfortably close to how democratic systems can be manipulated to validate predetermined outcomes while maintaining the illusion of choice. The vote isn't about whether to continue the game, it's about making the players internalize the game's logic as their own decision. The guards, those faceless enforcers who embody the banality of institutional violence. The guards in Episode 5 represent a fascinating study in how authority systems transform individuals into instruments of control. Through their geometric masks and color-coded uniforms, we see how institutional power strips away individual identity to create perfect functionaries. What's particularly striking is how the episode reveals that even the guards operate within their own hierarchy of fear. The guards embody what Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil, how ordinary people become capable of extraordinary cruelty when it's proceduralized and sanctioned by authority. They maintain fairness through unflinching violence, much like how modern bureaucracies can inflict systemic harm while claiming to uphold order. Most telling is the episode's revelation about No-Yul's role as a guard, a North Korean defector whose mission to allow hopeless people to pass on peacefully reveals how systems can reframe cruelty as mercy. It's rather like watching someone transform trauma into a job description. The character of Hyunju, whose presence adds a profound layer to the game's exploration of identity and societal value. Hyunju's character in Episode 5 represents a powerful commentary on how society commodifies basic human dignity. Her participation in the game to fund her transition surgery reveals how even fundamental aspects of identity become subject to financial gatekeeping. It's a stark reflection of how many transgender individuals must literally gamble with their lives, whether through dangerous work, medical tourism, or in this case, a death game, to access essential healthcare. The episode's treatment of her character is particularly nuanced in how it weaves together personal authenticity and systemic violence. When she explains her motivations, losing her military job after beginning transition and dreaming of a new life in Thailand, it highlights how discrimination creates a cycle of economic vulnerability. She's not just fighting for surgery, she's fighting for the right to exist in a society that has systematically closed its doors. Most revealing is how her role in the spinning top game, where she displays leadership and saves her team, contrasts with society's rejection of her capabilities. The game's deadly equality becomes, paradoxically, more accepting than the normal world she left behind, a cutting critique of how society wastes human potential through prejudice. The organ trading subplot in Episode 5 serves as a perfect microcosm of how capitalism commodifies human life. Through the secret dealings between the doctor and masked staff, we see how even in a game supposedly built on equality, market forces create their own hierarchies of exploitation. What makes this particularly brilliant is how it mirrors real-world medical inequities. Just as the doctor turns corpses into commodities for information advantage, our own healthcare systems often transform human suffering into profit margins. The masked staff's organ trade network is just a more honest version of how medical access is gatekept by wealth. The management's violent response to discovering this scheme carries its own dark irony. They execute the participants not for the moral horror of organ trafficking, but for disrupting the game's artificial equality. It's rather like watching a corporation fire someone for unauthorized profiteering while continuing their own systematic exploitation. To conclude our analysis of Episode 5, from the spinning top's precarious dance of survival to the organ trade's brutal marketplace, each element serves as a dark mirror to our own societal mechanisms. The episode masterfully weaves together themes of institutional control, commodified humanity, and the illusion of choice, creating a devastating critique of how systems maintain power through manufactured desperation. How it makes visible the invisible, forcing us to confront how our own society's games, while less literal, operate on similarly brutal principles. Whether it's the medical system's gatekeeping, democracy's manipulated choices, or identity's economic barriers, the episode reveals how survival itself has become a commodity to be traded, sold, and carefully controlled. We're all spinning tops really, convinced our wobbling is freedom while the ground beneath us tilts to someone else's design. The true horror isn't in the game's brutality. It's in how uncomfortably familiar its logic feels. What makes Squid Game particularly brilliant is not just its critique of capitalism, but its understanding of how systems of control operate through the illusion of fairness, choice, and merit, making us all willing participants in our own exploitation.